Hello, and welcome to today's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. I'm Will Salatan. I'm a writer for The Bulwark, and it's my pleasure to introduce our special guest, Andrew Weissmann. He's the author of Liar's Kingdom: How to Stop Trump's Deceit and Save America. Andrew is a NYU law school professor. He's a widely respected legal analyst on MS Now. He was a lead prosecutor in Robert Mueller's special counsel's office. He was chief of the fraud section in the Department of Justice, general counsel of the FBI under Director Mueller, a leader of the Enron task force. And he started out as an organized crime prosecutor in Brooklyn. Andrew co-hosts MS Now's award-winning podcast, Main Justice, and he writes the popular Substack newsletter Behind the Headlines. And I have to add, on behalf of the Bulwark, Andrew is a regular on our own illegal news. And since I've learned that Andrew is an inveterate punster, which I admire very much. And so I will tell you that on our podcast, The Illegal News, he regularly holds court as our resident wise man. So I'm sure you get that pun all the time, Andrew. Andrew, welcome and congratulations on the book. And let me start by asking you the obvious question. Why did you write this book? What was the problem that you thought was so urgent that you needed to speak out? And what is it that you have to say to us that is distinctive about the predicament that we find ourselves in?
Well, one, thank you very much for your introduction. Thanks everyone for tuning into this. Thanks very much to the club for having me and for having Will. I really look forward to the conversation and especially the questions that people have. Okay, so to answer your question, I started with what I'll say is two things that I thought were truisms. One is that we have a problem of political lies. Not that there haven't been political lies in the past, pre-Trump 2.0, but that we have a real problem currently, and one that I don't think is going to go away because we have seen the modeling of political lies as being successful. That was sort of meaning you can't wave a magic wand and it's going to go away. Even if like Trump were not president tomorrow, we would still have people emulating his example, and maybe on the right and the left and in the middle. So that was sort of one truism. The second thing was our media environment. And this is probably the part of the book when I discuss it that's the least original, to your point of sort of what am I adding that's new. This is where I have read a lot about this, and I give a sort of pithy synopsis. But the issue of media bubbles, and I know, Will, I've talked to Sarah on the Bulwark about this, and she is also wrestling with this issue of sort of the fact that we no longer if we ever were, we're no longer in a situation where Walter Cronkite tells us, here are the facts, and there's a sort of a core set of facts that are believed by a vast majority of people. And that it's only going to get worse because you can stay within your particular media bubble and you're not confronted with opposite views, and there isn't sort of like a baseline of fact. And with AI, it really is only going to get worse. So those were sort of the two things that I took as the problem. And I was thinking, okay, how are we going to deal with this? How are we going to have a situation where if somebody says, and I took this as this sample lie of, because I wanted to pick something meaningful, because there, as probably people listening to this know, there was a lot to choose from in terms of political lies, and so I just took the one which is with us now, but has been with us for a while, which is that there was material fraud in the 2020 election. And I thought, how is it that there are no legal repercussions for saying that to the American people if you are a political leader with an obligation to be truthful to us, or a candidate for office with an obligation to be truthful to us? And sorry for the really long answer, but I then really could relate it to my personal experience. I was a prosecutor for over 20 years. I was a defense lawyer for about 10 years. Most people don't know that about me. They think of me as only a prosecutor. And to be fair, that is sort of how, to the extent that I have any sort of public name, it's as a result of that role. And I thought we prosecute and subject to criminal law so many different lies. Michelle will talk about that more. And we have civil laws also where we do not permit without sanction all sorts of lies. And I thought, okay, why are we exempting political lies from that stricture? And I then sort of in analyzing this, looked at what we do in the United States. I looked at what we do federally and at the state level. And then I did something that Ruth Bader Ginsburg is a big fan of, which is I looked overseas to see, are there examples or models that we could learn from other countries? And don't worry, I don't bore everyone with a tour of the globe, but I do pick four countries that I thought had different models, and sort of England, France, Germany, and Brazil. And I sort of talk a bit about what those models are and how they might be useful to us in thinking about how do we, on the 250th anniversary of our country, deal with something that I think is so problematic for the continuation of our democracy.
Mhm. So let me ask you about the situation that you're arguing against. So the question is, why do we need to change the rules of politics? So the founders of this country set up this marvelous system where people can listen to what politicians say, and if the politicians are lying, the citizens can punish them by voting them out in elections. Andrew, it's worked for 250 years. Why not leave it alone? Why do we need to change it?
So that is the traditional model, and it's one that Oliver Wendell Holmes sort of coined, although he didn't directly use the phrase marketplace of ideas, but he set that in a very famous case. He set that idea, and you still hear it from various Supreme Court justices, which is that the answer to false speech is true speech. That there is a marketplace where the truth will out, and that you don't need laws at all other than a marketplace. That as long as if someone says something false, that you can just confront and present to the world the truth, and that will be fine. So here's one thing that we know about that's not working now. But I have a fair amount to say, and there's more in the book, obviously. But um, two-thirds of Republicans believe, according to reputable polling, that there was material fraud in the 2020 election. A third of the electorate believes that. So that's already telling you something because there was no fraud that is material in that election. So that's a good sort of data point for the people who say, don't worry, false speech can be counteracted by true speech and the truth will out. That's not happening. I mean, like we know that's not happening, and we know it's not happening with something that is a core falsehood. And it also doesn't deal with the subject that we were just talking about, which is that we're in a very different media environment. This is not a small little community where there's a little, like the Greeks would think, oh, you just you would go to the marketplace and everyone hears the same thing. That's not happening. It also is not the answer that we use in all the other situations where people lie. So if I prosecuted, as you mentioned, people and with a wonderful team in Enron, which was like 20 years ago, and it's an example that I use for my own personal life. Corporate leaders lying about the true state of affairs in Enron and saying it publicly, and we protect shareholders. And those corporate leaders were prosecuted criminally and convicted, and they were sued civilly. And the answer in the law was not, don't worry, Ken Lay and Jeff Skilling and Andy Fastow, um, if they're lying to the public, just speak more about the truth, and that's the answer. When you lie to Congress, the criminal law makes that a crime. We don't say, well, don't worry, just say what the truth is. And one of the anomalies that I deal with is that it is a crime by statute if you lie to Congress. If you go to Congress and testify under oath, that is a crime. If Congress lies to us, that's not a crime. Um, and and I mean, it's no doubt because I mean, guess who's making the laws? So it's a one-way street. If you lie to banks, if you lie to Department of Justice prosecutors, or I used to be the general counsel of the FBI, if you lie to the FBI, whether under oath or not, that's a crime. If you are Rudy Giuliani and you say something false about Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss, the two Georgia election workers, they can sue for defamation. They did. He was found liable and paid tens of millions of dollars. And to take something very ripped from the headlines, unfortunately, E. Jean Carroll sued the current president for defamation and sexual assault, but I'm going to focus on the defamation part. And two separate civil juries found in her favor for false statements that were made about her. We don't say in all of those situations, well, don't worry, it goes to the marketplace of ideas. The answer is just more true speech. And so you still have this anomaly of why, with respect to people who owe us so much because they are in public office, and they should have if anyone should have this higher obligation, it should be an elected official. And so that's the anomaly that I'm addressing in this book.
Uh-huh. I want to pull on this thread of your critique of the marketplace of ideas because it actually raises some very profound questions about human nature and democracy. And I know you've mentioned that your mother spent her career as a psychologist. So this
Yeah.
is about human psychology. You write in the book that when we're all on social media, the task of sorting truth from falsehood, and this is a quote from you, is left to the users themselves, which presupposes the same unlimited time and interest that the progressives, by which you mean the progressive movement of 100 years ago, that the progressives realized was unrealistic to expect from most or even many voters. So to me, Andrew, that sentence raises some very profound questions about democracy because I guess the question I would ask you is, do you believe that most voters, whether because of their own lack of interest or because they just don't have the time, cannot effectively judge the truth or falsehood of what they're seeing and hearing on the internet? And if that is true, then how should we think about democracy? I mean, at the Bulwark, we talk about democracy all the time, but is democracy in this world that we're living in now fundamentally flawed or vulnerable?
So those are sort of great questions. To take the last thing first, which is democracy vulnerable? I mean, of course, it is in the sense that just if you look through history, democracies are a relatively new thing. It is not something that, if you again think about sort of historical ways in which different countries have structured themselves, democratic structures are not sort of the vast majority. There have been all sorts of different ways of societies deciding how they're going to construct themselves or having it imposed on them. And so there's nothing inevitable about a democracy, nor is there anything about a democracy that is easy. It really requires work, and I really do think that we are at a defining moment because we're seeing what I would say is flaws in the way our society and our Constitution is constructed. Um, this sort of goes back to your question of, it's been working for 250 years. Why rock the boat? Which, you heard sort of my answer on that. And I think that uh, it isn't. Let me just think. I'm trying to think of like the best pithy way to explain this. Let me go to the part of this question that has to do with attention. I don't think that it's a problem of individuals aren't capable of judging, or somehow not being smart enough. I'm all for, and I think it's and the people who say that we need better civics education, and that we need to do better teaching, but that's not an immediate solution. And that is what I think is a sort of something that's required, but is a long-term solution for an immediate problem. So I give an example of that at the end, which is, that's like the captain of Titanic when they hit the iceberg saying, I think it's really important that we invest in better radar. It's like that is true, but it's not going to really deal with the situation we're in. But the issue of an attention span is a real issue, and it's actually something that the Progressive Party at the turn of the beginning of the 20th century dealt with in dealing with ballot restrictions. It used to be that anyone could sort of run for any office, and you had sort of scores of people running for elected office. And the result of that was that it gave inordinate power to party bosses. I'm sure some people listening to this will remember, not personally, but it will remember Boss Tweed in New York, because people do not have an infinite amount of time to learn about scores of people who are running for office. And so there was an issue of how are you going to deal with the fact that if you have no restrictions, you actually are, yes, it's great you have an enormous choice, but that actually dilutes the power of the voter and gives enormous power to elites who have undue access to the airwaves. So think of, like, if you were thinking about a current model, you'd be thinking about Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, people who own media companies or social media, who can essentially feed you information. And Woodrow Wilson, I think, coined the phrase that with this sort of disparate array of candidates, and thus very little voter education and true choice, party bosses were doing something that was coined, the phrase was coined, asparagus voting. So just think about how you buy asparagus, or at least how I buy asparagus. I'm an inveterate New Yorker, so it already comes bunched for me. And the idea is that a party boss has already bunched the people together. So this is your slate. And so all you have to do is think about that slate, and they're endorsed. And so the progressive movement came up with the idea that there should be limits on who can run for office, to better assure the fact that the citizens had the time and ability to think about each candidate and to make a decision for ourselves, because of the reality of how much time and energy each person was going to be able to devote to educating themselves. So oddly, restricting the number of people was actually enhancing the sort of one person, one vote principle. And this past Supreme Court muster, even though it may seem oddly counterintuitive, it actually strengthened the right to vote. And as you can understand why it would be the Progressive Party that was behind this, it weakened sort of political bosses from having that inordinate power. So that's a very long answer to your question, and sorry for the history lesson, but it is somewhat fascinating, and it is analogous in some ways to at least one of the proposals that I talk about, which is the idea that you might forego, if you have been found to have lied about something material in the election, that you may be precluded from running for office for a set time period, something that happens, for instance, in France, it happens in Brazil. And so you have this oddity of removing somebody from being able to be on the ballot, which you might think, well, that seems unfair, but there is precedent for that kind of restriction to better assure people's ability to have a stronger vote.
Uh-huh. So look, I think you've made a really interesting case for mediation and structure in democracy, and we can talk more about that if you want to go to that. But you just touched on one of your proposals, so I'd like to go to that if we can.
Sure.
So in the book, there are three. You lay out three different texts, legislative texts that we could enact to control this problem of lying. And I'm going to start with the main one, the Truth in Elections Act. So I'm just going to quote it, okay? Andrew writes, under this text, anyone who knowingly and willfully makes any false, fictitious, or fraudulent statement or representation about the election results or process in any federal election with an intent to cast doubt on the integrity of the results or process will have committed a civil offense for which disqualification from elected office may be imposed for up to 8 years. And you have some caveats on that, and I'll let you talk about those. But here's what I want to ask you first about your proposal. Liars are very sneaky, as you know. So when Donald Trump lies about the 2020 election, sometimes he says it was stolen. And it seems to me that what the law you've drafted here would clearly apply to that. Mostly he doesn't use the word stolen. Mostly he uses the word rigged. It was rigged. And that gives him and his supporters a whole array of things they can talk about. A classic example is, in Pennsylvania, they went around the legislature and they sent out mail ballots to everybody. And they were changing the procedures in a way that wasn't approved by the legislature to help the Democratic candidate, and that influenced the outcome of the election. So we can call that rigged. Now, they are accomplishing the same thing that you're trying to solve here, which is they're undermining faith in elections, but they're doing it without quite lying in a way that your text might apply to. Or correct me if I'm wrong, how would your law apply to that situation?
So let me first maybe boil down to two models, what I sort of talk about so people sort of understand it in sort of a higher level. Because I do really write this for non-lawyers, and because I want people to sort of think about this idea and to be thinking about what structural reforms could really help solidify our democracy. One set of solutions deals with the idea of if you are found to have lied, that you can be precluded from running for office for a set period of time. That's what I call the sort of French or Brazilian model. They both have versions of that. The other is if you are found to have lied, you can be prosecuted. That's a criminal law. Those are sort of the two basic types of things. And one thing people should note is that this could happen at the federal level and it could happen at the state level. And in fact, many states have versions of these laws that are not identical to what I'm saying, but there are a surprising number of states in the United States that already do things that people might find surprising. So my general answer to your question about couldn't someone try to get around making a false statement is the answer is yes. This is one where I was a prosecutor. I was a defense lawyer altogether for like 30 years. That's a standard issue that comes up. Putting on my defense lawyer hat, if the person is not intentionally lying, if they haven't said something that is actually false and intending it to be false, then and the government can't prove it, by whatever standard it is, beyond a reasonable doubt, whatever the legal standard is, then that's the way the law works. I mean, that this is not trying to criminalize something that is not intentionally false. It is not, if you make a mistake, it is not something that would ever preclude someone from holding office or from being prosecuted. If you were to make a statement about that you believed about an opinion. So, for instance, many people will say, I think that the Constitution protects a woman's right to choose. Somebody else may say, in good faith, that they don't think that the Constitution protects a woman's right to choose. That is an opinion. And that's a viewpoint as to what they think the law is or what they think the law should be. This law has nothing to do with that I'm proposing. I'm talking about something that is provably false and intentionally so. Now, if somebody says that um, uh, something is rigged, and their defense to that is, no, when I said rigged, I had the view that Will had. I was talking about they structured the election in a way that it would favor um, this party or that party, like the gerrymandering that we are seeing going on. And if somebody said, I think that what they're doing in gerrymandering, and it could be on the right, the left, the middle, is rigging an election, you're never going to be able to prove that's false. But if the language is clear enough that the person has said, I think that I won the election, there was material fraud, and because I actually won, which by the way, Donald Trump, I won't say says every day, but it's pretty darn close. And it's actually a litmus test. Um, then that wouldn't be allowed. And to take something else that is ripped from the headlines, and that's sort of a good example of what you're saying. If you take a photo of seashells on the beach with four digits, 8647, and your defense is, it didn't occur to me in a million years when I took that photo that 86 meant to kill. I thought it meant that he should not be the president. Well, the government has the enormous burden of proving beyond a reasonable doubt in a criminal case that that is what was in the person's head when they took the photo and put it on social media. So that would be a good example of if it's something that is so ambiguous, it is not going to be covered. And as somebody who believes in due process, I think that's right. Not just in the 8647, but when it's something that I think, okay, that seems pretty close. Well, pretty close doesn't cut it. But I would like politicians to be thinking about something that journalists think about all the time. And I won't say that I'm a professional journalist, but I am a legal analyst for MS Now. I also have a podcast, as you mentioned. You work for The Bulwark. One of the things that reputable journalists do, and when I say reputable journalists, I am including people in the middle, on the left, on the right, in reputable organizations, is we have standards departments that make sure that what we are saying is true, is sourced, is accurate. And they're doing that for a number of reasons. One is because that's what we owe the public, is that we shouldn't be disseminating something that doesn't meet that category, those qualifications. But the other is to make sure that we are not sued for defamation. And so that is a way, even in journalism, the fourth estate, something that's so critical to a democracy and to a healthy democracy, there is that effect in the law, which is, I think, a good thing, not a bad thing, that you are thinking about those things before you speak. And so if in your hypothetical, the politician thinks, wait a second, let me think about my words, because if I start saying something that is really like they're going to be able to say that's false. If I say I won the election, there was material fraud, Joe Biden couldn't possibly have won, that I can't say that. Then if they're backed off of that, that's a good thing for democracy.
Right, right. It is a great irony, of course, that Donald Trump sues ABC and other media organizations claiming they have they've made these false statements about him, a standard that he doesn't apply in the slightest to himself. But
Huge. Couldn't agree more. Lots to say on that.
yes, okay, so we can follow up on that. But let me imagine that you're bringing your proposals to control to rein in the lying in politics to Congress. You actually are going to try to pass one of these laws. And I'm a Republican, and I'm very skeptical to begin with here. Now, your Truth in Elections Act would not apply to the case I'm about to give you because it's specific to lying about an election. But you have another proposal in there about where candidates would have to certify that their statements during the campaign are true. If I'm not mistaken, that would apply more broadly. So that law would apply in this case. So let me take you back to June 2024, the Trump-Biden debate. And as you know, Trump lied profusely in that debate. And after the debate, Joe Biden and Jill Biden came out and spoke to their supporters and pointed out, and the media pointed out all the lies that Trump had told. But I'm going to read you one line from the Jake Tapper and Alex Thompson book about the Biden campaign, so you'll have an idea where I'm going with this. This is at the night of the debate. Quote, "There was at that moment no lie more widely discussed than the one that millions of Americans now realized they'd been told for months. The lie that Joe Biden was perfectly fine and up to the task of being president for 4 more years." Now, you can argue, I'm a Republican, I'm going to say, Andrew, wasn't that lie enormously consequential? Didn't it deceive an enormous number of Democratic voters who, if they had known the truth, would have asked for a different nominee? And should your proposal be applied in that case? You've spoken about lies told by Donald Trump, by other Republicans. What about this falsehood and there's plenty of documentation that the White House and people around Joe Biden deliberately concealed from voters the extent of his impairment?
Yeah, so I think the answer to that is sort of twofold. One, there are different ways to structure a law that deals with making false statements. And I sort of talk about this in the book, and I sort of say, you could be very puritanical. There's a part of me that appeals to, which is any lie told by an elected official is one lie too many. And it would cover then things like, so I'm going to get to your hypothetical, your not so hypothetical. But that could include how you did it in college, or the crowd size that you had at the inauguration, things that are, I won't say minor, but more minor than there was fraud in the election. And so you can have a model that is what in Brazil, which is that the lie that is disqualifying has to do with undermining the integrity of the election in terms of the vote. That would be a narrower circumstance. In other words, if you could cabin this to a smaller set of circumstances, that may be enough though to cover what you're saying. But what I'm saying is I'm not partisan in this thing. If there is proof, and proof that could meet that, I had a very high standard in my sort of hypotheticals that I posed towards the end of the book. If there was proof that you could show that somebody intentionally lied about it, withheld information is a little different. I'm not going to get into the nuance between intentionally lying versus misleading through omission. But let's assume in your hypothetical, they actually say something and you could prove that when campaign manager X, person X says he's totally fine and he's been totally fine and he's going to be totally fine, that they in fact had just had a discussion with him and his doctors saying he's not fine, and there's a real problem. I mean, just to be clear, this is a high standard of proof, and if it's just sort of an opinion of I think he can handle the job, I think that's got the ambiguity of 8647. But if it's like he is has no medical issue. He has no whatever the lie is. If it is clear, then yes, this law would deal with that. And isn't that a good thing? In other words, isn't your hypothetical, assuming you had the facts that this was um, uh, these were people working for a candidate. Doesn't matter whether he is currently the president or he's just a candidate not in office running to be president. And they are intentionally lying about his ability to do the job. And again, not just saying, "Oh, I think he can do the job." That could be true, but they're intentionally lying about his medical state. Isn't that something you want? Which is, I'm sorry, if you are misleading the public about that, shouldn't there be a sanction? And if the law were on the books, wouldn't that be a deterrent to someone saying, "Well, we can't say that," but not just because it's a bad thing to do, but we run the risk of prosecution or being barred from ever holding office. So a lot of the law works that way. It's like, everyone here, I'm sure, has, I'm not going to say everyone here has been in a car and been speeding, but I'm sure people have witnessed it if they haven't done it themselves. And the whole idea of having speeding laws and occasionally the police running around, checking and you see someone pulled over is the deterrent effect of the law to make you not speed, or at least only speed a little bit.
Right.
By the way, I'm not confessing to anything here.
So I think you've given a terrific answer to the Republican who asked that question. Let me give you a different question that the Republican or Libertarian might ask you about your proposals.
Yeah.
Here's another case. You write in the book about COVID. You mentioned the lies told about COVID. Oh, it's not real, the vaccine, lies about the vaccines. However, and this goes to your point about the marketplace of ideas. So one of the defenses people make of marketplaces is, yeah, they have a lot of flaws, but they're better than the alternative, which is central planning. And so in your hypotheticals, under your proposals, somebody has to administer this decision to decide whether to prosecute somebody or investigate someone or bar them from office for lying. The danger is, of course, that that central authority, and we have a very clear example in the present administration, can abuse that power. But there is an example that they would point to. So as the Republican, I'm not going to talk about the Trump administration. I'm going to pretend that's fine. The Biden administration, during COVID, there was material removed from the internet. It was removed by big tech companies, but supposedly in consultation with the government. A classic example, I have looked at this. Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, did roundtables with doctors, with medical experts who agreed with him in his view of how to approach the pandemic. Some of that material is just gone. It was just struck from YouTube. I've viewed it. I don't agree with some of it, but it wasn't misinformation in my opinion. But in the name, because that was lies or misinformation, that was removed. So that, as this Republican or Libertarian, I'm going to ask you, what about the danger that the government, acting under these texts that you've recommended, might suppress what they're calling lies, but which are actually
true, which are actually true. Yeah, which are true or a different point of view. Absolutely. And I'm enough of a lawyer that when you think about something, your training, or at least I teach, and I'm one of the things that I hope to instill in students is thinking about, well, what are the downsides of your position, and one of the questions I always say to students is, I want you to think about the best argument on the other side that someone could take in good faith. Don't presuppose a bad faith response because that's too easy. Think about what's the best argument against you, and does it cause you to change your view? Is it not persuasive, and why is it not persuasive? Is it something that it's got validity, but it still doesn't carry the day because you think it's outweighed by the positives of what you're proposing? To really think hard about what the downsides are. And by the way, this is what you do in government when you're thinking about policies. You get people together and you sort of really wrestle with this, or at least I should say, this is what my experience in the government was under Republican and Democratic administrations. There was this kind of healthy debate. So that's all a lot of thread clearing to get to your question. And I'm sure some people are like, what's the question again? Um, and so I think that there are a couple of answers. One is the issue that you are raising in general about what I will call, and as people think of as the weaponization of the justice system, um, uh, that can happen with any new tool that is created. That, in other words, you can be like, well, there's a law against lying to Congress, or there's any sort of new law or even old law can be weaponized. And one of the ways that we deal with that, in addition to trying to have ethical and responsible people, is that there are checks in the system, so that you do require a grand jury indictment. You do require a defense lawyer, and if you can't pay for one, it's paid for you. And then there's proof beyond a reasonable doubt by a unanimous jury. By the way, I wrote a piece today in the New York Times having to do with the grand jury system and these retributive indictments. So it's very much on my mind, this idea of retribution and how the law can be weaponized. And I give another proposal, which I think could be easily implemented to make that harder. So the one answer is like what you are identifying is a problem that we already have in the system and that we are dealing with all the time. I mean, the whole idea of the criminal justice system, and frankly, even the civil justice system, is to deal with what happens when the government or just any person is suing in the civil context or the government in a criminal context, and it's abusive. And they are trying to say something is true when it's false or false when it's true. The second is a little bit more nuanced, which is my suggestions for what we might do in this country reject the German model. That, remember, I said I talked about various models, and the German model that I use is in Germany, and frankly in other countries, but it's more poignant for Germany. It is impermissible to deny the Holocaust, the fact of the Holocaust, and that has been upheld as constitutional under the German Constitution. And I'm just going to give I quote one of the more poignant passages of that constitutional decision. And I just want to warn people, it really isn't nerdy. I mean, I had a wonderful, wonderful editor who took a lot of my nerdiness and got rid of a lot of it. So you still hear my voice, but I think we were very focused on trying to make sure that this was something that, without quote dumbing it down, because I really don't believe in that. I really believe in speaking up to people, but trying to not use technical language. But the German model, which is the government saying, you can't say X. We have determined that X is true, and you can't say that. That has problems because it's the state deciding what is true and what isn't true. And there are so many issues that can be involved in that, including what's the standard of proof and who gets to decide that, and at what point does something that is contested become sufficiently uncontested that you want a state to be stepping in and to have that awesome power. I reject that. As not to say that Germany shouldn't do it, they certainly have a huge history that's unique. They have other values that they weigh against their First Amendment values. And so there's a lot to be said for their system, but I don't think that would fly in this country where we view the First Amendment differently. What I'm proposing is something that's totally consistent with how we have false statements in numerous other contexts. So we have a statute on the books today that just says it is a crime to make a false statement to, and then there's all sorts of officials that are, I mentioned Congress, or to banks, or to the FBI. The content of that is not determined by the state. What is false or what is true? You can be charged with making a false statement, but a jury is going to determine whether that is something that is true or not the state. And so, if you can show in your example that, you know what, there is good science behind what I am saying about COVID, or let's take something that is more contested, which is, how did COVID start? Where, it is not 100% clear. That could never be the subject of a false statement charge. I'm enough of a both prosecutor and defense lawyer to say what you're raising is an issue we already have dealt with. That opinion will never count. That is never going to be an issue. And a false statement is something that it better be so clear that this is false and intentionally so that you're going to be able to prove it.
Okay, so I've grilled you plenty now about your proposals. Let me back
I
off a
love
little bit
it.
because I want to
Yeah.
read my favorite sentence from the book. Okay,
Okay.
everybody has their favorite sentence. This is mine. Um, you're explaining why you want to take political lies and bring them into the courtroom. And here's what you write: a courtroom is one place where adjectives and epithets cannot stand for actual proof. And to illustrate your point, you note, this is another quote, not a single court has vindicated the Trump lie of election fraud in the 2020 election. So that is very true. That is very true. It's profoundly true. So what I want to ask you is, let's suppose that we can't enact or decide not to enact your proposals that would either bar candidates from elections when they lie or would subject them to prosecution. So we're not going to literally bring those lies into the courtroom. Nevertheless, are there ways, short of that, in which we could bring elements of the courtroom into the political arena, which is to say, are there any ways in which we can change the political process so that adjectives and epithets are subjected to demands for actual proof? Because I agree with you about the courtroom. It's beautiful the way that narrows the process,
Yeah.
forces people to account for things. I would love to believe there's a way that we can do that.
Yeah. So one thing I will say, and I think I'm pretty good on air is I try to stay in my lane in terms of my expertise. So, that this is one where, if Sarah Longwell was here, I would say, Sarah, what do you think? Or if Lawrence O'Donnell were here, I'm fortunate to be on his show a lot, and he has a long history dealing with Congress. I will give you. I'm not going to duck. I'm going to tell you my ideas, but I do want to give the caveat that this isn't like my expertise, and so I usually try to stay within like what I really know, and so as I mentioned, what I was telling you about what I took to be givens, I don't think we're going to be able to change what's happening in the media environment. I think it's like saying I want to fight the wind and the tide. I think that is it reminds me I'm old enough to remember when it's like you cannot bring a calculator and you shouldn't even be using calculators because we want to make sure that you're doing the math yourself. Well, that's good luck because that's gone. And so there's a certain amount of trying to deal with reality. But having said that, I want to make sure people know this is one suggestion of how to deal with the problem. There are myriad issues. As I mentioned, I just wrote about for the New York Times about how I think the grand jury system could be fixed. In terms of could you bring aspects of the courtroom, this truth-seeking function that you don't get away with adjectives and adverbs? Of course there is. So just to take political debates, and I'm very much sort of channeling my inner Lawrence O'Donnell, which is our political debates, at least the presidential ones, are just they're just cribbed lines, and there's very little where there's an actual discussion. And they're also not really representative of what you're voting for, because the way decisions are made is you really want to know about how is this person going to, what team are they going to put together? How are they going to make decisions? Who are they going to be calling on? It isn't sort of memorizing flip answers and just saying what comes out in polls. And we do not subject people to questions. You have to answer. If you don't answer, there's a follow-up question. If you don't answer that, you can go to the videotape and play when the person says they never said that or it's out of context. It's like, well, really? I'm going to play it. So that is something where we are not helping ourselves in the way that we are conducting, I think, political campaigns. To go to your point about spending and sort of the power differentials, sort of who has the access to information. This is, very much thanks to our Supreme Court, but we have a version of what the progressives were fighting against with the asparagus voting system when you allow hundreds of millions of dollars to be spent by individuals, and you have individuals who have sort of unilateral access to social media companies where the voice of an individual voter becomes so much less. And so I very much address a version of that. And when I discuss sort of the problem we're facing and look back to the progressive era as a model for ways in which people were dealing with this problem. So that's a long way of saying I am all for and look forward to people really thinking long and hard about the fact that we need to think our way out of the problem that we're in, and just bemoaning it or thinking that we can just somehow go back to where we were before all of this happened. That's never, in my view, that's never going to happen. We have somebody who has been successful at running for president twice. There are people who are going to emulate that recipe over and over again unless we come up with structures that won't prevent it, but make it less likely. Because we're still humans. We're still going to be doing what you're thinking about, which is how are they going to get around it? Right. But we can build structures that will help us better. I was in the intelligence community. This was the effort post 9/11, which is what structures we should have structures that we don't have to overcome to make our country safe. We should have structures that facilitate making our country safe. And so I was trying to apply that. I'm a huge fan of the 9/11 Commission report. I know I told you I'm really nerdy,
but it is a wonderful report. Yeah, they did a tremendous job. That is a great model for all topics. Let me go to some questions from the audience.
Great.
So we've got a couple here there's one on AI, which I would love to talk about, but you reminded me about staying in lanes. This one will get you in trouble, but I'll ask it anyway since it's in your lane.
Okay.
Someone asks, is the DOJ salvageable post-Trump or even sooner? Shouldn't the respective bars of the individual DOJ attorneys, AUSAs, take action against seemingly biased, unethical prosecutions? Obviously, this is all over the news, the weaponization of the Trump Justice Department. What are your thoughts on that?
So first, I'm going to say something really positive, which is I do think that the Department of Justice is salvageable and remediable upon a normal administration. I served in normal administrations that were Republican and Democratic. So this is not a partisan issue. It is one I've seen wonderful, wonderful leaders and apolitical people in both administrations throughout my career. And I think that there's so many people at the department and so many people who I think are principled. And I think that the institution itself is repairable. And I also think that it can model that behavior to the judges who have lost confidence in them, and most importantly, to the public, that has lost confidence. I think it is going to require being forward leaning and talking more to the public about what's going on and what they're doing and why they're doing it. I think they're going to have to be more transparent. Um, to the question about the bar associations, the bar associations, so I'm a lawyer. I am licensed in a particular state, some people in more than one state. And if something is done unethically by private lawyers or government lawyers, the bar associations can and do take action. I spoke about Rudy Giuliani. They took action with respect to him. Now, there is a pending case in DC with respect to Jeffrey Clark, somebody who let's just say he got in a lot of trouble for what he did as a senior DOJ leader in not following the orders and direction of the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General. And he has a defense, which is that I was following the orders of the president. But the Bar Association determined that what he was doing was improper and should be sanctioned. There still are appeals, so it's not a final determination. But this is a long way of saying that the bar associations are a check on DOJ lawyers who do something that violates those ethics rules. And the reason I'm sort of focusing on this is that 10 days ago, the Department of Justice, headed by Todd Blanche, filed a brief in DC, and the position of the Department of Justice is that bar associations should have zero role in overseeing Department of Justice ethics, that they cannot take action in the Jeffrey Clark case. It is remarkable. So that for people listening to this, and people may have followed the Broadview case where there was, the judge pointed out rampant problems in the grand jury, where one of the prosecutors was excused grand jurors who wanted to vote against the government's position, just took them off the grand jury, hid what happened from the judge. Under this brief, the Department of Justice's view, there would be no ethical consequences that could be brought, even if the person did that deliberately in violation of all duties of candor that you have to the court in terms of being transparent, in terms of how you're supposed to conduct yourself with the grand jury. They want to remove that as one of the last checks that we have. And I have to say, as somebody who worked in the department for 21 years, I want to be held to that standard. I mean, if you don't want to be held to that standard, don't do the public work. Go to the private sector, which, by the way, you should also be held to that standard, but particularly when you work for the public. So that is one where bar associations currently and the bars can take action, but people should keep an eye out for this litigation. Mary and I on our podcast on Main Justice cover this, and we are going to keep reporting on what happens with that litigation.
Good. I got to get this question in about AI, because I think this is where a lot of this stuff is going. So you've drafted some laws that can apply to lies, what we think of as statements. I'll just give an example. A couple of weeks ago, I saw an ad. This is one of the ads that they used, something called MAGA PAC, if I recall the name correctly, ran against Thomas Massie. So they managed to take out Thomas Massie in Kentucky in a Republican primary. The ad depicts him going to a hotel room with Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar. Part of this ad is, now some of it's obviously facetious. They're in a throuple. Maybe some people get it. But Andrew, in this ad, there is what appears to be security camera footage from the hotel lobby showing them walking hand in hand into the lobby. So a lot of people obviously understood that was, a joke. Some people didn't. Some people thought that was real. I didn't see any markings on it to indicate that it was fake. It looked real. And, we tell people you don't believe it till you see it. They're seeing it. So the AI is creating an image. So it's an image, not a text. Scenario one, how would your proposals apply to that? Scenario two, if they put in there a little bit of text saying this is just not a real image, but nobody can really see that. How do we deal with this world?
So one that can be dealt with right now by regulation. In other words, in terms of one way, easy way to think about what I'm proposing, truth in advertising. Um, okay, does anyone here take medication for anything? You cannot put on that medication anything you want. You can't put in teeny tiny letters something says, "Oh, by the way, it's poison." Um, there are all sorts of regulations as to how you deal with that. But I think AI is such a good example because the issue of the marketplace of ideas and what is true is only going to get worse with deep fakes and what you're talking about. And so one, it's you can always this reminds me so much of law school where people say, well, what about this and what about that? And those are if you have a bill that is in, let's just say state in a state, because that is where this is more likely to occur because you're more likely to find people who are sympathetic to this than at least obviously currently now in Congress. You can deal with those issues, but you can also have rules about what you need to do in elections, which is like in England, you cannot lie about your political opponent. And if you lie about your political opponent and it's found after due process, you're removed from office. And so if there's a campaign, that one of the cases in England, the person was found to have lied in a material way about their political opponent. And if that was found because they had promulgated a false AI image, and even if they put in some tiny little caveat that no one could see on frame 87, that someone will make a determination whether that was sufficient or whether it had a big label saying this is facetious and it's a joke because I'm really trying to make it just a comparison. But if it was clear what they were trying to do was thinking, you know what, a certain percentage of the population is going to believe this, and that's the whole intent. Well, in England, the candidate who won was not allowed to take his seat because he had violated this law. And we don't think of England as some wild, I'll use the so-called third world country. We think of it as a first world rule of law country where they are thinking their way through the issues that we have so far not dealt with.
So we only have a couple of minutes left, and I can't let you go without asking you this one personal question because this really
Sure.
struck me. This really moved me in the book. You mentioned early in the book that you said I have reclaimed my Austrian citizenship through your father was from Austria. You wrote understandable given our current political predicament. Well, I mean, it sounds to me like you were saying that you think that freedom in this country and your freedom in particular are in sufficient jeopardy that you and other people who have access to citizenship in other countries might want to consider at least preparing that as an option. Are you saying it's that serious?
So that's slightly out of context. I want to just give a little bit of context, which is that my father was born in 1930 in Vienna. And that comes up in the introduction when I'm talking to and recounting a conversation with my parents about the McCarthy period and comparing it to a particular phase of the first Trump presidency. And my father talks about Germany and his experience. And he was born in 1930. He was Jewish. He died shortly before COVID. And his family didn't leave. So he and my grandparents, his parents, left in 1938. So many people who are listening to this will know that's a little late because the border in Austria had closed. And now getting to so he was here in this country, and my sister is really the one I have to thank because she was worried about me, and she said, you know, Austria has a law and it allows us to be Austrian citizens. We had relatives who had done the same thing, who were more invested and closer to that, to Austria. And she said, you know, you really should think about doing that. And I just ignored it. I just didn't do it. But, she's my big sister, and she did all the paperwork and she did all of that. And, which is wonderful. And she called me up. She said, okay, I have done all the hard work. All you have to do now is file something that says you're your father's son. It was relatively simple. And by the way, the Austrian consulate and government could not have been nicer and easier to deal with, which was it. At a later time, they send you this wonderful, wonderful letter when you become a citizen that was so touching and so psychologically astute. It was remarkable. Like it was. At some point, I will recount for people that letter, and I'll try and dig it up because I have it at home. And so at that point, I thought, one, to answer your question, I need to do it because my sister is she's my big sister. So even at this age, no matter how old you get, you do what your big sister tells you. And two, to be more direct, it's like, it is a, it's like a safety net. And you're absolutely right. If I didn't think there was any chance in any way whatsoever, what are you thinking about? It would have been like, this is crazy, but we're not in that situation. And so it's not like I'm sort of hair on fire. I need to get it now, but given that circumstance, to me, it made sense.
Well, I think it conveys some of the seriousness with which you approach the problem that we're facing currently in this country. Andrew, thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you so much for doing it, and thanks everyone for participating.
You've put up with the law school grilling. So our thanks to Andrew. Our thanks to Andrew Weissmann, the author of Liar's Kingdom: How to Stop Trump's Deceit and Save America. We encourage everyone to pick up a copy of Andrew's book at your local bookstore. And if you'd like to become a member and support the Commonwealth Club's efforts in making virtual and in-person programming possible, please visit commonwealthclub.org. I'm Will Salatan. Thank you, and take care.